Now, across the continent, many state-owned enterprises have struggled to keep up with the changing times, the growing population and its needs, as well as living up to delivering their responsibilities. We've seen bailouts from taxpayers, privatization, and more. But many African countries seem reluctant to let go of their state-owned companies. In Nigeria, a panel has been put together to review these entities and see if they can be saved from dying. In South Africa, an extension of the Zimbabwe exemption permit continues to generate controversy. We'll get into exactly what it involves and what the extension actually means. And on today's Women in Business, we're in the travel and tourism industry. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. Let's get to it. South Africa's Eskom has announced stage 2 load shedding will be back from today and further power cuts will be implemented until Saturday. The struggling utility firm said that stage 2 will be implemented later today and will resume in the early hours every day till Saturday night. Load shedding is a key contributor to the 0.7% contraction in the economy for the second quarter of 2022. In East Africa, the chief executive of Kenya's Rural Electrification and Energy Corporation, Peter Mbugwa, is among top managers at the state corporation who have been suspended over fake surveys estimated to have cost over $500 million shillings. An internal audit revealed the company paid at least 430 million shillings for geospatial engineers and business consultants. Economists have marginally upgraded Kenya's growth outlook for this year following the peaceful conclusion of a closely contested presidential vote, despite soaring cost of living and mounting public debt stress. A consensus growth outlook from 14 leading global banks, consultancies, and think tanks shows economic activities could expand 5.5% this year, a 0.1 percentage point rise over the month before the general elections happened. And Zambia wants $8.4 billion in cash debt relief from this year through 2025. The International Monetary Fund has affirmed the request in a report. This request will set the tone for complex restructuring negotiations with creditors ranging from Chinese state-owned banks to Eurobond holders. Zambia, which became Africa's first pandemic-era sovereign debt defaulter in 2020, finalized a deal with the Washington-based IMF last week for a $1.3 billion bailout and economic program. Those are a few business headlines to get your business juices going today. On the show, right after the break, we get into what Nigeria can do to save its dying state-owned enterprises. The conversation after this. From the onset, state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, financial and economic performance has generally failed to meet the expectations of their creators and founders. And this is unfortunately true across the continent. There were actually African SOEs that performed, at least for a time, adequately and sometimes very well by the most stringent of standards, including Ethiopian Airlines, the Kenya Tea Development Authority, and Sierra Leone's Guma Valley Water Company. But the good performers were heavily outnumbered by the bad. Numerous studies and reports have documented the poor technical and financial performance of African SOEs in general and infrastructure SOEs in particular. Many failed to produce a sufficient quantity or high quality of service or product and have continued to pose increasing financial burdens on strained state budgets. Now, Africa's largest economy is taking another look at its SOEs and must decide what their futures hold. The Bureau of Public Enterprises has constituted a panel that will review and implement strategic roadmaps for the resuscitation of ailing enterprises across the country. Gospel Obele, Chief Economist for Streetnomics, joins me now to look at this and really answer the question if Nigeria can save its state-owned enterprises. Gospel, welcome to the show. Good to have you back.
Hi, Tolu. Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So we know that Nigeria has a host of state-owned enterprises. There are those owned at the federal level as well as those owned at the state level. But in general, we've seen all of them struggle in one fashion or form. So let's start from there. Why have the state-owned enterprises in the country struggled so much, which is possibly the same reason many across the continent have also struggled?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So there are a couple of reasons to it, and we want to start from a design stage. It's also the reasons why, when we move from military to civilian government, sort of, or to the democratic government, we still have the ropes and institutions of a military order, at play, technically, in a democratic government. So what that means is that though the privatization may have happened, but the design, the structure, the culture and the process of doing things, within that privatized institution is still driven by the fabric of a public sector driven institution to a very large extent. So it lacks the institutional elements, that are truly required for privatization and for some form of innovative led leadership, to scale in terms of results-based operations and engagement. So these are majorly design questions. And you want to also talk about the way in which these privatized organizations are structured in the first place. So a lot of times the structure is still reflective of what happens in the public space, than a truly privately led, structure designed to deliver the results required.
So let's look at this in terms of this very, I guess, and depending on the side of the conversation you're on, the famous or infamous saying in which we hear all the time that government has no business being in business. And these state-owned enterprises are not just companies where we're giving money away. They are meant to serve some kind of public good. We can look at what happened in the privatization of the power sector in Nigeria. There are calls now for even the water sector to also be privatized because government has failed to basically provide that public service for citizens. But there has to be a balance to these things. So what should we see being opened up in terms of what the private sector is being brought in for and what we really need to see government keeping also for the benefits of all and maybe not just those who can afford certain services?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, truly, government doesn't have a business being in business, but the truth of the fact is that you need governments to create the enabling environment required for business to thrive. That's number one. Secondly, if you're thinking of privatizing or if privatization is underway, you also need government to truly hand over the structure and elements, that would make privatization really work and scale for the critical mass. So those two things, those two legs of necessities have to be in place. In the Nigerian context, number one, you don't have an enabling business environment. Number two, privatization really did not happen on the grounds of scalable privatization. Privatization happened on the ground of more skewed design elements, or more ethnic grounds, or more nepotism-driven grounds, or more bureaucratic grounds. Privatization was just a reflective order of how governments truly run. So it was just a change of name, not necessarily a change of culture, a change of people, a change of institution, and all that. So those necessary elements have to change. For us to begin to look at the sufficient side of things, which will mean that are we truly navigating these privatized institutions towards more growth and development? So also, to a very large extent as well, you also have cases where government holds a critical share, of the new privatized outfit, or if not government, people inside government hold a critical share. So the control mechanisms around how privatized institutions still work is still largely public sector or government driven. So there's no really privatization in the context of how these structures are designed to scale in the first place. So first of all, there's a lot around the structure, the motive, the intention, and and the balancing until the dynamics are being truly moved to the privatized sector. To the private sector, and you have some more enabling business environment around it. We may not necessarily be able to. And the big question again will be the conversation of how do you make public services, in quotes, affordable and formal, or some form of, how do you provide quality services at little or no significant cost? That's going to be a very big conversation, especially within the context of an economy that is largely still driven by imports, largely still driven by a crippled agricultural and industrial processing sector, and a lot of dynamics that needs to work for privatization to truly be effective for the common good of everybody.
All right, so those who may not know, this is not really the first time that Nigeria has gone through this type of process. And there have been several along the ways in the country's democracy, but one of the biggest in recent times was in 2018 with a report finally submitted in 2020 as well. What really came of that review that may be possible for this panel now to build on, or are they really looking at starting from scratch when it comes to reviewing the state of Nigeria's state-owned enterprises?
I mean, clearly, one of the major headline insights were 16% of privatized engagements, failed, woefully, and there's also some form of drastic increase, concern increase in the percentage share of privatized organizations that are failing or have a potential to fail than a potential to succeed, as it were. So there are big questions around how do you restructure, what kind of institutional standards and procedures need to be introduced, right, to ensure that future privatization efforts or current privatization efforts are being sort of like revamped, for critical reform purposes and all that. So that's one of the major things on the table. However, from my own context of things, any nation that is extractively designed, no matter how much of efforts are being put in the mainstream to sort of like redesign and improve the set of things, the control will still fall back to the extractors themselves. All right, so you can see PHCN workers complaining about poor conditions of work and all that. Mind you, poor conditions of work exist everywhere, both in core private sector, but there is always a limit, to the the balancing around conditions of work and the need for core productivity, right? So for us to achieve the latter, there is need to decentralize the control arm. All right. So no matter how much of privatization happens, if the extractors, all right, still retain control of the institution, you can't really do much. No matter how much of reform you bring to the table, you still fall back to some element of failure or the other. So I think from my own perspective, if Nigeria is really going to go through the way of privatization, we really need to privatize, number one. Two, the core enablers that would make privatization work in terms of scaling quality and quantity. So if you want to ensure that every Nigerian has access to clean water, how do you scale clean water in quality and quantity? And how do you make it such that it doesn't have to be until I have some power in my house before I can have water? If there has to be water either ways. So how do you scale efficiency of privatized institutions in terms of delivering public goods over time? And how do you manage the cost side, being the fact that you're not necessarily a productive economy to start with? All right, so these are critical blocks of questions that strategic responses need to be provided to, as well as the need to decentralize the control side of things for us to even see any light, to start with. Being the result and the diagnostic study that the BP underwent in 2018.
All right, so there are a number of things I want to sort of wrap up in my next question here. So this new review will also have a business plan attached to it, which is expected to meet the current sectoral requirements, examine the challenges that each of these state-owned enterprises is having in their industry, and also develop a comprehensive 5-year turnaround plan. But then you also can see one of the things that happened in recent times, that involves the Ajakuta Steel Company. And that was a concession, which is also a form of moving towards privatization, but having state control. And Nigeria had been involved in a long-standing $5.26 billion contractual dispute, which was just recently settled for around $496 million. Then you also have the issue of the Nigerian refineries. As it stands right now, the government is being taken to court about the money being spent on the Nigerian refineries, saying that they reportedly spent $396 million for maintenance of the refineries between 2015 and 2020, and yet the country has seen how many fuel scarcity experiences in recent times. So when you look at some of the examples, you look at what this panel is particularly meant to look at, you have to ask the question, is Nigeria really ready to take the necessary decisions? Because when you look at the list of these state-owned entities, you're going to get to a point where you have to realize that some of them simply have to go. So is this going to be an economic conversation in the long run, or a political one, or one that has to marry the two?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I'm looking for the best way to start the response. So yeah, it has to be one that marries the two, because you can't take politics out of privatization, and you can't take the economics of privatization, the reality around the economics of privatization, if privatization must be truly effective. What we find is we're trying to have one without the other, but in the real state of how the world works, even in developed economies, there is a mix. In a way, it's also always a mix of complementary effort as well as a form of compromise, in terms of how privatization works. Even in developed economies, you have the same challenge. However, you want to also think of the weight of how much of, so take for instance, why do you have a situation where illegal refineries are more productive than legal refineries? All right, why do you have that situation more in Nigeria, than the other way around? All right, but then again, the conversation should be that how do you begin to balance out, because there are leakages in the system. It's an heavy extractive driven system. What extractive would mean that few people want to be in control of the resource or the economic machineries used to amplify control or power, as it were. Right. So what needs to happen here is there has to be a balance around the political and the economics of things. And secondly, the ideology around privatization has to be for the common good of the average person, and in the real sense of things, if you truly privatize for the good of the average Nigerian, at the end of the day, the benefits will go round technically. In terms of, you have economic benefits, you will have political benefits as well. Although there may be one or two rooms to compromise, but it will be done at a relatively, okay or sensible level, as it were. Right now, the ideological engine that drives privatization is really, really, really cancerous to the development of the average Nigerian and the average Nigerian economy. So that's the big question you have here. So. And it's the same attitude you find around managing refineries, and the amount of money that's going to managing refineries are not working, But then again, you find huge numbers of illegal refineries opening in these same clusters that are feeding a lot of formal institutions as well. So I still believe heavily it hinges around the extractive state of things in Nigeria, the ideology and the culture that drives for value delivery or value exchange, until the powers or the control side begin to rethink how to distribute power and how to distribute value. We may not necessarily get to the position where privatization will begin to work. And that's the truth. No matter how much of research and reforms you bring to the table, until there is a review of that ideology on how value should be spread and made available for everybody, and how value can be rewarded. I'm trying to use very, very plain ways to say it. And how value can be rewarded for the common man and the powers that be. We may not be able to find any strategic pathway. So it's not an activist conversation. It's not a Nigeria must work conversation. It's the need to find balancing, and a win-win across all stakeholders involved with a new ideology on the table.
So my final question is this, because every time this conversation comes up, the conversation of employment and loss of jobs come up. And we do know that in some regards, the Nigerian government is one of the largest employers of labor in the country through the civil service and through some of these state-owned enterprises. But Ajaokuta has never produced a kilogram of steel for exports, but people are there getting salaries. Refineries have not produced enough crude sufficient to feed or to at least help the consumption of Nigeria, but people are there getting salaries. So when you look at the salary conversation wrapped around what is necessary for the responsibilities and deliverables of these SOEs, where do you place that? And we've mentioned privatization, but is privatization the only way to go in reviving state-owned enterprises? And that will be where we wrap things up.
Yeah, so I spoke a bit around these things before. I think the issues exist in different blocks. So you have the core privatization block. You now have the institutional enablers of the elements that drive the engine room for the privatization itself. All right. In an extractive economy, you find a lot of leakages. In fact, intentionally, leakages are designed, to sort of like empower the minority in the sense of things. So that's what you find, right? Refineries are not working, but people are getting salaries and all that. So to be honest with you, there has to be a critical reform. There has to be reforms around the civil service and around how institutions work. Until those reforms are led intentionally by the institutions or the powers that be, in quotes, from a revised or reviews or a changed ideology perspective, we may not find any critical change. All right, so those shouting for reforms must also look at the ideology that drives those reforms in the first place. Because if the ideology does not change, the reform will only exist on paper. And you have more numbers of people collecting salary from refineries and don't work. So it has to be a mix of relatively some compromise, and some complementary efforts among stakeholders to make it work. And when it works, it begins to work for everybody. You can't drive a 21st century economy without appealing to the stakeholders or the systems, that institute those things in the first place. And that's where the ideology to drive the right reform starts from.
All right. Unfortunately, the last review took 2 years to complete. Hopefully, this one might be quicker, so we'll have a roadmap and we'll see what happens next. Gospel Obele, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Tolu.
All right. And as I said, the Bureau of Public Enterprises says they are raising this panel that will put together a business plan for these state-owned enterprises in the different sectors. It will look at the challenges of the sector and develop a comprehensive 5-year turnaround program for each of the non-performing enterprises. Another question is, would Nigeria be ready to cut off and let go of some of these enterprises that don't have a future, as my guest said, in a 21st century economy? You're watching Business Edge. Up next, we have international business news. The Biden administration has announced that U.S. tech companies that receive federal funding will be barred from building advanced technology facilities in China for 10 years. The guidelines were unveiled as part of a $50 billion plan aimed at building up the local semiconductor industry. This comes as business groups have pushed for more government support in an effort to reduce reliance on China. Both the U.S. and China are locked in a long-running dispute over trade and technology. Official data has revealed that an aviation staffing crisis that disrupted flights across Europe this summer is most acute among a younger category of workers who largely left the industry during the coronavirus outbreak. Eurostat revealed that about 320,000 people worked in the EU air transport industry in the first 3 months, a quarter fewer than an equivalent period of 2020 before COVID lockdowns led to mass layoffs and the lowest tally in 14 years. Airlines have been forced to scrap thousands of flights as airports shrink schedules in response to the shortfall, with the situation exacerbated by strikes among pilots, cabin crew, baggage handlers, and others pressing for higher pay. India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman says the country's inflationary pressure is not a red-letter priority, but Asia's third largest economy will prioritize job creation and equitable wealth distribution. While speaking at the U.S.-India Business Council's India Ideas Summit, she said the government has been able to bring the inflationary pressure to a manageable level. In addition, she also said that governments will review the functioning of the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund to make it more robust. The United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific has reported that half of the Asia-Pacific region's workforce is poor or on the verge of poverty, surviving on $5.50 per day. The UN report noted that with more than half the region's population excluded from any social protection, the workforce is highly vulnerable to systematic shocks such as pandemics or economic downturns. The main reason is that 2 in 3 workers are employed informally. That is 1.4 billion workers, with 600 million of them found in the agricultural sector. And this comes from the 2022 Social Outlook for Asia and the Pacific, the workforce we need. Japanese government officials have revealed that the yen has slumped to a level that leaves it on track for its worst year on record, prompting the strongest warnings to date. The currency fell over 1% to 144.38 per dollar on Wednesday in a third day of declines as a fresh wave of dollar strength ripped through Asia and beyond, putting pressure on a range of foreign exchange markets. In his strongest remarks yet, Chief Cabinet Secretary Hirokazu Matsuno said he was concerned about the recent rapid one-sided move and that Japan will need to take action if it continues. And those are a few international business headlines for you. When we come back after the break, we're in South Africa, where the government has extended the Zimbabwe exemption permits. We'll tell you what it is, what the controversy is about, and what happens next.